The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the Georgia State Capitol building as Zara Jackson approached the imposing structure. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the concrete, each step deliberate and purposeful. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place through years of meticulous work and unwavering dedication. Her dark business suit was impeccably tailored, her briefcase leather and well-worn from countless meetings and presentations. Zara had been the state auditor for 3 years now, a position she had fought hard to attain and worked even harder to excel in. Her reputation for thoroughness and integrity had earned her respect across party lines, though it had also made her enemies among those who preferred their financial dealings to remain in the shadows. Today was no different from any other she had been called to investigate irregularities in the city's police department budget, and her preliminary findings had already raised several red flags. As she climbed the steps, her mind was focused on the task ahead. The numbers didn't lie, and what she had discovered in her initial review suggested a pattern of financial misconduct that went deeper than anyone suspected. She had requested additional documentation from the police department, but her calls had been met with delays and excuses. That was why she was here today to get the records herself. Officer Brian Stilinski sat in his patrol car across the street from the Capitol building, his eyes fixed on the woman ascending the steps. He had been watching her for the past 10 minutes, his jaw clenched in frustration. Brian was a 15-year veteran of the force, a man who had grown comfortable with the way things worked in their department. He had heard through the grapevine about some auditor poking around their finances, asking uncomfortable questions about overtime payments and equipment purchases. Brian wasn't particularly bright, but he was cunning in the way that men who abuse their power often are. He had benefited from the loose oversight that had allowed certain officers to pad their paychecks and had no interest in seeing that system dismantled. When his sergeant had mentioned that the state auditor was a young black woman, Brian's prejudices had immediately kicked in. In his mind, she was probably an affirmative action hire, someone who had gotten her position through quotas rather than merit. He watched as Zara paused at the top of the steps, checking something on her phone. Brian's radio crackled to life, but he ignored it. His attention was entirely focused on what he saw as an opportunity to intimidate someone he viewed as an outsider who didn't belong in a position of authority. Brian stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his utility belt and straightening his shoulders. He was a large man, standing 6 feet 3 inches, with the kind of build that came from years of trying to compensate for his insecurities through physical intimidation. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, and his expression carried the arrogance of someone who had never truly been held accountable for his actions. He crossed the street with purpose, his hand resting casually on his radio as if he were responding to some official business. In reality, he was operating entirely on his own initiative, driven by a toxic combination of racism, sexism, and fear of losing the corrupt system that had enriched him for years. Zara was scrolling through her emails when she heard heavy footsteps approaching. She looked up to see a police officer walking directly toward her, his expression stern and unwelcoming. Her instincts, honed by years of dealing with hostile witnesses and uncooperative officials, immediately went on alert. She had encountered enough resistance in her career to recognize when someone was approaching with confrontational intent. Officer Stilinski stopped directly in front of her, positioning himself to block her path to the building entrance. His stance was aggressive, designed to intimidate, and his eyes held a coldness that Zara recognized all too well. She had seen that look before from men who resented her authority and questioned her right to hold it. "Excuse me, miss," Brian said, his tone dripping with condescension. The word miss was delivered with particular emphasis, a deliberate choice to diminish her status. "I need to see some identification." Zara raised an eyebrow, her expression remaining calm despite the obvious provocation. "I'm sorry, officer, but what is this regarding?" "I'm simply entering a public building. Brian's jaw tightened at her composed response. He had expected her to be flustered, maybe even intimidated. Instead, she stood her ground with a poise that only irritated him further. "This is regarding suspicious activity," he said, his voice growing louder. "I've received reports about someone impersonating a government official." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Zara's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the tactic for what it was. She had dealt with similar attempts at intimidation before, though rarely so blatant and never in such a public setting. She could see pedestrians beginning to slow their pace as they passed, drawn by the unusual sight of a police officer confronting a professionally dressed woman on the Capitol steps. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and Jerome stepped inside along with several other defendants and their attorneys. As the doors began to close, he caught sight of Campbell and Morrison continuing their conversation, their body language suggesting they were discussing him specifically. Jerome's expression remained neutral, but internally he filed away every detail of their interaction for future reference. The elevator climbed slowly to the 7th floor, stopping at various levels to discharge passengers heading to different courtrooms. Jerome remained silent during the journey, listening to the nervous chatter of other defendants and the professional conversations of their lawyers. He understood the anxiety these people felt for many of them. Their entire futures hung in the balance of decisions that would be made in the coming hours. When the elevator reached the 7th floor, Jerome stepped into a hallway lined with benches where defendants and their families waited for their cases to be called. The atmosphere was heavy with tension and uncertainty, punctuated by whispered conversations between lawyers and clients, crying children who didn't understand why their parents were so worried, and the occasional outburst from someone overwhelmed by the gravity of their situation. Court Clerk Andre Johnson sat behind the information window, processing paperwork and answering questions from anxious defendants. At 28, Andre had worked in the federal court system for 6 years, starting as a filing clerk and working his way up to his current position. He took pride in treating every person who approached his window with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances or the charges they faced. "Next," Andre called out, looking up from his computer screen as Jerome approached the window. "Jerome Williams," Jerome said quietly, sliding a summons through the slot in the bulletproof glass. "I'm scheduled for a hearing this morning with Judge Peterson." Andre examined the document, typing Jerome's name into his computer system. The case details appeared on his screen, showing tax evasion charges and a court-appointed attorney named David Chen, who was actually Special Agent David Chen, one of Jerome's most trusted operatives. "You're on the docket for 10:30, Andre said, his tone professional but kind. "Your attorney is already here, waiting in conference room B. Would you like me to let him know you've arrived?" "Yes, please," Jerome replied. "Thank you." Andre picked up his phone and dialed an extension. "Mr. Chen, your client, Mr. Williams, is here." "Yes, sir. I'll send him back." As Andre provided directions to the conference room, Jerome noticed the respect and courtesy in the young man's voice. It was a stark contrast to the assumptions and prejudices he had observed from Campbell and Morrison downstairs. Andre treated every defendant with the same level of professionalism, a quality that Jerome mentally noted as exemplary. The conference room was small and windowless, furnished with a simple table and 4 chairs. Agent Chen, posing as defense attorney David Chen, stood as Jerome entered. Chen had been with the FBI for 12 years, specializing in undercover operations and white-collar crime investigations. His appearance had been carefully altered for this assignment, his usual sharp suits replaced with the slightly worn attire of an overworked public defender. "Good morning, Mr. Williams," Chen said, maintaining his cover even in private. The room could potentially be monitored, and breaking character was not a risk either man was willing to take. "Morning, Counselor," Jerome replied, settling into one of the plastic chairs. "What's our situation looking like?" Chen opened a case file filled with documents that appeared to outline Jerome's defense strategy. In reality, the papers contained updates on the investigation and intelligence gathered about the targets they were pursuing. "The prosecutor seems confident," Chen said, his tone suggesting concern about their chances. "They're pushing for a quick resolution, but I think we can argue some procedural issues that might work in our favor." Jerome nodded, playing his role as a nervous defendant while Chen briefed him on the investigation's progress. 3 judges were under scrutiny for accepting bribes in exchange for favorable rulings, while several police officers and court personnel were suspected of evidence tampering and civil rights violations. The operation had taken months to set up, requiring extensive background work and careful coordination with honest members of the court system. Meanwhile, back in the courthouse lobby, Campbell and Morrison continued their security duties with the casual indifference that had become their trademark. They observed defendants coming and going, making snap judgments and crude comments about people they knew nothing about. 10 more minutes until the morning session starts," Morrison said, checking his watch. "Wonder how many of these clowns will actually show up to face the music." Campbell laughed quietly. "The smart ones probably skipped town already. The ones who are left are either too stupid to run or think they can talk their way out of anything." Their conversation was overheard by several defendants sitting nearby, including an elderly woman whose son was facing drug charges and a young father who had been caught up in a financial fraud case beyond his understanding. The casual cruelty in their words added another layer of stress to people already facing the most difficult moments of their lives. As 10:30 approached, Jerome and Chen made their way from the conference room to the courtroom. The hallway had filled with lawyers, defendants, families, and court personnel preparing for the morning docket. Jerome observed everything with the trained eye of a law enforcement professional, noting security procedures, personnel interactions, and potential vulnerabilities in the system. Judge Harold Peterson's courtroom was imposing, with dark wood paneling and high ceilings that seemed designed to intimidate those who entered. Peterson had served on the federal bench for 15 years, during which time he had developed a reputation for running an efficient courtroom with little tolerance for disruption or delay. What few people knew was that Peterson was also the primary target of Jerome's investigation. The bailiff called the court to order as Judge Peterson took the bench, his black robes and stern expression commanding immediate attention from everyone present. Peterson was 62 years old, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everyone who appeared before him. His manner suggested authority and wisdom, but beneath the surface lay a corruption that Jerome was determined to expose. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The Honorable Judge Harold Peterson presiding. Please be seated and come to order." Jerome took his seat at the defendant's table next to Agent Chen, maintaining the nervous posture of a man facing serious federal charges. Around the courtroom, other defendants waited their turns, some whispering anxiously with their lawyers, while others sat in stunned silence as the reality of their situations became clear. In the back of the courtroom, Campbell and Morrison had positioned themselves near the door, ostensibly for security purposes, but actually to continue their running commentary on the proceedings. They had no official reason to be in the courtroom during regular sessions, but their supervisor had been lenient about their duties as long as they maintained a visible security presence. "Look at that guy in the Navy suit," Campbell whispered to Morrison, nodding toward Jerome. "Bet you he's scared now that he's actually facing a federal judge. Reality has a way of sobering people up real quick." Morrison studied Jerome's posture and demeanor, interpreting his careful composure as barely controlled fear, probably wondering if he should have taken whatever plea deal they offered him. These tax cases are slam dunks for the prosecution. Neither officer realized they were commenting on a man who had stood before countless courtrooms in his career, not as a defendant, but as the nation's top law enforcement official. Jerome had testified before Congress, briefed presidents, and commanded the respect of prosecutors and judges across the country. The irony of their ignorance was not lost on him as he prepared for his performance to begin. The morning would bring revelations that none of them could anticipate, setting in motion events that would shake the foundations of the courthouse and expose corruption that reached far beyond anything Campbell and Morrison could imagine. As Judge Peterson prepared to call the first case, Jerome Washington, FBI director, sat quietly at the defendant's table, ready to begin the most important undercover operation of his distinguished career. Judge Peterson adjusted his reading glasses and opened the morning docket, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. The court calls the case of United States versus Jerome Williams, case number 2024 CR 1247. Charges include federal tax evasion and failure to report income. Jerome stood beside Agent Chen, his hands folded respectfully in front of him as Peterson reviewed the charges. The judge's demeanor was professional but carried an undertone of impatience that suggested he viewed this as routine business to be dispatched quickly. "Mr. Williams," Peterson said, looking up from the documents, "you are charged with willful failure to pay federal income taxes in the amount of $47,000 over a 3-year period, and failure to report income from various business ventures. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Jerome replied, his voice clear and respectful. Peterson made a note on his paperwork before addressing Agent Chen. "Counselor, I trust you've advised your client of the seriousness of these charges and the potential penalties he faces?" "Yes, Your Honor," Chen replied. "We believe there are substantial questions about the government's evidence and look forward to presenting our defense." From the prosecution table, Assistant United States Attorney Lisa Bennett stood to address the court. Bennett was 34 years old, ambitious and intelligent, with a reputation for thorough preparation and aggressive prosecution of white-collar crimes. She was unaware of Jerome's true identity and was playing her role exactly as briefed by her supervisors. "Your Honor," Bennett said, "the government has substantial evidence of Mr. Williams's willful tax evasion, including financial records showing unreported income from multiple business ventures. We believe Mr. Williams poses a flight risk given the serious nature of these charges and request that bail be set accordingly." Judge Peterson nodded, his expression suggesting he was inclined to agree with the prosecution's assessment. Jerome noticed the subtle interplay between Peterson and Bennett, the kind of familiarity that developed between judges and prosecutors who worked together regularly. It was exactly the type of relationship that could facilitate corruption if ethical boundaries were crossed. "Mr. Chen," Peterson said, "what is your client's position regarding bail?" Agent Chen stood, consulting his notes with the careful attention of a public defender managing multiple cases with limited resources. "Your Honor, Mr. Williams has deep ties to the community. He's lived in Chicago for over 20 years, owns a small business, and has no prior criminal record. He surrendered himself voluntarily when charges were filed and has cooperated fully with the investigation. We respectfully request reasonable bail that reflects his lack of flight risk." Peterson appeared to consider both arguments, though Jerome suspected the judge had already decided the outcome before hearing from either side. The FBI director had reviewed Peterson's sentencing patterns and noticed troubling disparities that suggested bias in his decision-making, particularly regarding defendants of different racial backgrounds. In the back of the courtroom, Campbell and Morrison watched the proceedings with the detached interest of security personnel who had seen similar hearings countless times. Campbell leaned slightly toward Morrison, keeping his voice low enough to avoid disrupting the court but loud enough to be overheard by nearby spectators. "Look at this guy trying to look respectable," Campbell whispered. "Clean suit, polite answers, probably coached by his lawyer on how to act in front of the judge." Morrison nodded, his eyes fixed on Jerome's composed demeanor. "They all do the same thing, act like model citizens when they get caught, but where was that respect for the law when they were cheating on their taxes?" Their comments reached the ears of several spectators, including Jerome's fabricated family members, actually undercover FBI agents posing as concerned relatives. The agents maintained their cover while internally documenting every aspect of the officer's unprofessional conduct. Judge Peterson cleared his throat before delivering his decision. Given the substantial amount involved in these charges and the defendant's access to financial resources that could facilitate flight, bail is set at $75,000. The defendant will surrender his passport and is prohibited from traveling outside the Northern District of Illinois without court approval. Jerome showed no reaction to the bail amount, though Agent Chen made a show of conferring with his client about their ability to meet the financial requirement. The bail had been predetermined as part of the operation, with FBI resources standing by to ensure Jerome's release without compromising his cover. "Your Honor," Chen said, "we accept the court's bail conditions and will post bond immediately." "Very well," Peterson replied. "Mr. Williams, you are released on the conditions stated. Failure to comply with any aspect of your bail will result in immediate revocation and detention pending trial. Your next appearance is scheduled for—" He consulted his calendar. "October 15th for a status conference. Court is adjourned on this matter." As Jerome and Agent Chen gathered their papers, the subtle dynamics of the courtroom became clearer. Jerome observed how certain defendants received different treatment based on factors that should have been irrelevant to their cases: their appearance, their attorney's reputation, even their apparent social class. It was exactly the kind of systemic bias that the FBI investigation was designed to expose. The bailiff called the next case, and Jerome made his way toward the courtroom exit. As he passed Campbell and Morrison's position near the door, he overheard their continued commentary. "$75 grand, Morrison said quietly. "Bet you he can't come up with that kind of money. Probably end up sitting in lockup until his trial." Campbell smirked. "Nah. These tax cheats always have money stashed somewhere. He'll be out by this afternoon, probably planning his next scam already." Jerome paused momentarily, pretending to check his phone while actually observing the two officers more closely. Campbell was approximately 6 feet tall with close-cropped brown hair and the build of someone who spent considerable time in the gym. Morrison was shorter and stockier, with graying hair and the weathered appearance of a veteran police officer. Both men wore their uniforms with the casual authority of officers accustomed to being obeyed without question. More importantly, Jerome noted their name tags and badge numbers, information that would be crucial when the time came to document their conduct. Campbell's badge number was 4789, while Morrison displayed badge number 2156. Both were assigned to the 14th District, according to the patches on their uniforms. "Excuse me," Jerome said, approaching the officers with the deferential manner of a defendant seeking information. "Could you direct me to the clerk's office? I need to arrange for my bail." Campbell looked Jerome up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Third floor. Take the elevator down and follow the signs. Can't miss it." "Thank you, officers," Jerome replied politely. Morrison shook his head as Jerome walked away. Polite now that he needs something. Wonder how polite he was when he was hiding money from the IRS. The interaction was exactly what Jerome had hoped for, a clear demonstration of the officers' biased attitudes that could be documented and used as evidence of systemic problems within the courthouse security detail. Every word, every gesture, every assumption was being carefully cataloged for future reference. Agent Chen caught up with Jerome at the elevator bank, maintaining his role as a concerned defense attorney discussing the case with his client. "How do you think that went?" Chen asked, his tone suggesting cautious optimism mixed with realistic concern. "Better than expected," Jerome replied, keeping his voice low. "The judge seemed fair and the prosecutor was reasonable with her arguments. Their conversation was purely for the benefit of anyone who might be listening, but it also served to reinforce their cover identities." Chen had been briefed extensively on Jerome's fabricated background and was prepared to discuss the details of the tax case as if he had been working on it for months. The elevator arrived and they descended to the 3rd floor where the clerk's office handled bail payments and other administrative matters. The office was busy with defendants and their families navigating the complex paperwork required for various court proceedings. Jerome observed the efficient but impersonal nature of the system, noting how people were processed through various stages with minimal individual attention. Andre Johnson was working the bail window when Jerome approached, his professional demeanor unchanged from their earlier interaction. Andre had processed hundreds of similar transactions and took pride in treating every defendant with the same level of courtesy and respect. "Mr. Williams," Andre said, recognizing Jerome from the morning docket, "I have your bail paperwork ready. The amount is $75,000, and you have several payment options available." Jerome nodded, producing a cashier's check that had been prepared as part of his cover identity's financial resources. The check was drawn on a legitimate bank account established specifically for the operation, complete with a financial history that would withstand scrutiny if investigated. Andre processed the payment efficiently, explaining the bail conditions and providing Jerome with copies of all relevant documents. Throughout the transaction, Jerome noted Andre's professional conduct and genuine concern for ensuring that defendants understood their obligations. "Is there anything else you need help with today, Mr. Williams?" Andre asked as he completed the paperwork. "No, thank you," Jerome replied. "You've been very helpful." The interaction with Andre stood in stark contrast to Jerome's experience with Campbell and Morrison, highlighting the difference between professionals who respected the dignity of all individuals and those who had allowed prejudice to corrupt their judgment. As Jerome and Agent Chen left the clerk's office, they encountered Assistant United States Attorney Bennett in the hallway. Bennett appeared to be reviewing case files while walking, her attention focused on preparation for her next hearing. "Ms. Bennett," Agent Chen said, intercepting the prosecutor, "I wanted to follow up on our earlier discussion about discovery materials." Bennett paused, consulting her notes about Jerome's case. "Yes, Mr. Chen. My office will provide all required discovery within the standard time frame. Is there something specific you're concerned about?" "Just ensuring we receive all relevant financial records and correspondence," Chen replied. "My client maintains his innocence and we want to review everything thoroughly." Jerome remained silent during this exchange, playing the role of a defendant who was nervous but determined to fight the charges. Bennett's professional demeanor suggested she was focused on prosecuting the case based on evidence rather than personal bias, which Jerome appreciated even though she was technically his adversary in the proceeding. "You'll receive everything you're entitled to under the discovery rules," Bennett assured them. "If you have specific concerns about missing documents, please contact my office." As Bennett continued down the hallway, Jerome reflected on the complexity of his situation. He was simultaneously the target of a federal prosecution and the director of the agency that had initiated the investigation leading to these charges. The irony was not lost on him, but it also underscored the importance of the corruption investigation he was conducting. The morning had provided valuable intelligence about the courthouse's operations and personnel. Judge Peterson's handling of the bail hearing would be analyzed for signs of bias or inappropriate influence. Campbell and Morrison's comments had been documented as evidence of discriminatory attitudes that could affect their treatment of defendants and court visitors. Andre Johnson's professional conduct had been noted as an example of proper behavior that should be the standard throughout the system. As Jerome and Agent Chen prepared to leave the courthouse, they passed Campbell and Morrison's position one final time. The officers were engaged in conversation with a court clerk, their body language relaxed and familiar in a way that suggested long-standing relationships with courthouse personnel. "Same time tomorrow?" Campbell was asking the clerk. "Should be," the clerk replied. "Judge Peterson likes to start his docket promptly at 9:30. Jerome filed away this information as potentially significant. The casual familiarity between courthouse security and court personnel could facilitate corruption if proper boundaries weren't maintained. It was another piece of the puzzle he was assembling to understand how systemic misconduct could flourish in an environment that should be dedicated to justice and fairness. The investigation was just beginning, but Jerome already had valuable intelligence about the targets of his operation. The real work would come in the weeks ahead as he navigated the federal court system while gathering evidence of the corruption that had prompted this unprecedented undercover mission. The autumn air was crisp as Jerome stepped onto the courthouse steps, his temporary freedom secured by the bail payment that had just been processed. Agent Chen walked beside him, maintaining the appearance of a defense attorney providing reassurance to his client after a successful hearing. "We should discuss strategy for the next appearance," Chen said, his voice carrying the right mixture of professional confidence and underlying concern. "I'll need to review all the discovery materials once we receive them from the prosecution." Jerome nodded, playing his role as an anxious defendant trying to process the morning's events. "How long do these cases usually take to resolve?" he asked, genuinely curious about Chen's assessment of the timeline they were working with. "Could be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on the complexity and whether we go to trial," Chen replied. "The government seems confident in their evidence, but there are always avenues to explore." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stone steps behind them. Campbell and Morrison had emerged from the courthouse, their shift apparently ending with the conclusion of the morning docket. Jerome could hear fragments of their conversation as they descended the steps. "Told you that guy would make bail," Campbell was saying. "These white-collar criminals always have resources hidden away somewhere." Morrison laughed quietly. "Yeah, probably had more money stashed than most people make in a year. Makes you wonder why he needed to cheat on his taxes in the first place." Jerome slowed his pace slightly, allowing the officers to pass, while continuing his conversation with Agent Chen. The FBI director's years of training in surveillance and counter-surveillance made it natural for him to gather intelligence, even in situations where he appeared to be the target rather than the investigator. "I should get going," Jerome said to Chen as they reached the sidewalk. "Will you contact me once you've had a chance to review everything?" "Absolutely," Chen replied, shaking Jerome's hand with the formal courtesy of a professional relationship. "We'll be in touch within a few days." As Agent Chen walked toward the parking garage, Jerome made his way to the bus stop where his fabricated identity would logically choose public transportation over the expensive parking options near the federal courthouse. The bus route would take him through several Chicago neighborhoods, providing an opportunity to observe the city from the perspective of someone navigating the criminal justice system without the resources of wealth or influence. Campbell and Morrison had gotten into a marked police cruiser parked in a restricted zone near the courthouse entrance. Jerome observed them through his peripheral vision, noting their casual dismissal of parking regulations that would result in hefty fines for ordinary citizens. It was a small but telling example of how some law enforcement officers viewed themselves as above the rules they were sworn to enforce. The bus arrived 10 minutes later, its brakes hissing as it pulled to the curb. Jerome climbed aboard, paying his fare with exact change like any regular commuter. The afternoon crowd was a mixture of courthouse employees heading home, defendants and their families processing the day's legal proceedings, and ordinary citizens going about their daily routines. Jerome found a seat near the middle of the bus, positioning himself where he could observe other passengers while appearing to be lost in thought about his legal troubles. The fabricated identity of Jerome Williams included a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood, complete with neighbors who were actually FBI agents maintaining surveillance on the building. As the bus pulled away from the courthouse, Jerome reflected on the morning's intelligence gathering. Judge Peterson's handling of the bail hearing had been professional on the surface, but Jerome had noted subtle indicators that suggested the judge might be predisposed toward prosecution arguments. Peterson's eye contact patterns, his tone when addressing different parties, and his body language all provided clues about potential bias that would require further investigation. Campbell and Morrison's commentary had been even more revealing. Their casual racism and classist assumptions about defendants demonstrated attitudes that could affect their interactions with citizens throughout their careers. More concerning was their apparent comfort in expressing these views openly in a federal courthouse, suggesting a workplace culture that tolerated or even encouraged such behavior. Andre Johnson's professional conduct had provided a positive contrast, showing that it was possible to work within the same system while maintaining respect for all individuals regardless of their circumstances. Jerome made a mental note to ensure that Johnson's exemplary behavior was recognized when the investigation concluded. The bus made several stops as it traveled through downtown Chicago, each one bringing a new group of passengers with their own stories and challenges. Jerome observed a young mother struggling to manage two small children while balancing a folder of legal documents, an elderly man clutching a summons with shaking hands, and several other individuals whose body language suggested they were dealing with legal problems that threatened to overwhelm them. These observations reinforced Jerome's understanding of why the corruption investigation was so crucial. The federal court system wielded enormous power over ordinary citizens' lives, and any abuse of that power represented a betrayal of the public trust that could have devastating consequences for individuals and communities. Jerome's phone buzzed with a text message from a number he didn't recognize. Package delivered successfully. Client satisfaction confirmed. It was coded language from his FBI team indicating that his performance in court had been convincing and that surveillance of the courthouse personnel was proceeding as planned. He deleted the message immediately, then sent a brief reply. Meeting went well. We'll schedule follow-up as discussed. The response would confirm to his team that he had gathered useful intelligence and was proceeding with the next phase of the operation. The bus reached Jerome's neighborhood 45 minutes after leaving the courthouse. The area was typical of working-class Chicago communities, rows of modest houses and small apartment buildings, corner stores that served as neighborhood gathering places, and streets lined with older cars that showed the wear of hard-working owners who couldn't afford frequent replacements. Jerome's fabricated apartment was in a 3-story brick building that had been constructed in the 1940s. The FBI had rented the unit 6 months earlier, creating a believable living situation complete with utility bills, a rental agreement, and neighbors who had been carefully briefed about Jerome Williams's supposed background as a small business owner facing financial difficulties. As Jerome climbed the stairs to his second-floor apartment, he encountered Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who lived across the hall and was actually a retired FBI agent brought out of retirement for this specific operation. Mrs. Rodriguez had spent 20 years in the Bureau's Undercover Operations Division and was perfectly suited to play the role of a concerned neighbor. "How did it go today, Jerome?" she asked, her voice carrying the appropriate mixture of curiosity and sympathy that a neighbor might show for someone facing legal troubles. "Could have been worse," Jerome replied, maintaining his cover identity's tendency toward cautious optimism. "At least I'm not sitting in jail tonight." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded knowingly. "These legal things take time to sort out. I'm sure it will work out in the end." Jerome thanked her for her concern and entered his apartment, which had been furnished and decorated to match the lifestyle of a small business owner facing financial pressures. The furnishings were functional but not expensive. The refrigerator was stocked with modest groceries, and the bookshelf contained titles related to small business management and tax preparation that supported his cover story. Once inside, Jerome activated a small electronic device that would detect any surveillance equipment that might have been planted in the apartment. The device was disguised as a digital clock radio, and its sweep confirmed that the apartment remained secure from outside monitoring. Jerome changed from his court appearance clothing into casual attire that matched his cover identity's off-duty style khakis, a polo shirt, and worn sneakers that suggested someone who was careful with money. He prepared a simple dinner while reviewing the day's events in his mind, cataloging every detail that might be relevant to the investigation. His phone rang at 7:30, the caller ID showing the number for Agent Chen's cover identity as defense attorney David Chen. "Jerome, it's David. Do you have a few minutes to discuss today's hearing?" "Of course," Jerome replied, settling into a chair by the window where he could observe the street while talking. What's your assessment? I think we're dealing with a prosecutor who's playing by the rules, Chen said, referring to Assistant United States Attorney Bennett. She seems focused on the evidence rather than playing games. The judge is harder to read, but he followed standard procedures. Jerome understood that Chen was providing his analysis of the courthouse personnel they had observed, using language that would be appropriate for a lawyer-client conversation in case the call was being monitored. What about the security situation? Jerome asked, inquiring about Campbell and Morrison without naming them directly. Some concerns there, Chen replied carefully. I noticed some unprofessional attitudes that might affect how they interact with defendants and visitors. Might be worth documenting those issues for future reference. Their conversation continued for 20 minutes, covering logistics for future court appearances while actually coordinating the next phase of the undercover operation. Jerome's team would expand their surveillance of courthouse personnel while he continued to play the role of a defendant navigating the federal court system. After ending the call, Jerome prepared for evening surveillance activities that would provide additional intelligence about his targets. The investigation required gathering evidence outside the courthouse as well as within it, tracking the daily routines and associations of personnel who might be involved in corrupt activities. Jerome's experience as FBI director had taught him that corruption rarely existed in isolation. Officials who accepted bribes or engaged in discriminatory practices usually had networks of associates who either participated in the misconduct or enabled it through their silence. Identifying these networks was crucial to ensuring that the investigation addressed systemic problems rather than just individual bad actors. At 9 o'clock, Jerome left his apartment and walked to a nearby coffee shop that provided a clear view of a restaurant where Judge Peterson was known to have dinner several evenings per week. The FBI had been monitoring Peterson's routine for months, identifying patterns that could provide opportunities for surveillance or that might reveal suspicious activities. The coffee shop was modest but comfortable, with mismatched furniture and a menu focused on basic coffee and sandwiches rather than expensive specialty drinks. Jerome ordered black coffee and found a seat at a small table near the window, positioning himself where he could observe the restaurant while appearing to read a newspaper. Peterson arrived at 9:20, accompanied by two other men Jerome recognized from courthouse surveillance photos. One was Assistant United States Attorney Robert Hayes, a senior prosecutor with 20 years of federal experience. The other was Detective Lieutenant Frank Sullivan, who supervised courthouse security for the Chicago Police Department. The three men appeared relaxed and familiar with each other as they entered the restaurant, suggesting a social relationship that extended beyond their professional interactions. Jerome noted their body language and seating arrangement, observing how they chose a corner booth that provided privacy for their conversation while allowing them to monitor the restaurant's other patrons. Jerome sipped his coffee slowly, using the newspaper as cover while maintaining visual surveillance of the target group. Their animated conversation and occasional laughter suggested they were discussing more than routine courthouse business, though Jerome couldn't hear their specific words from his position across the street. At 10:15, Peterson's dinner companions left the restaurant, but the judge remained behind, checking his phone repeatedly as if waiting for someone. 5 minutes later, a woman Jerome didn't recognize entered the restaurant and joined Peterson at his table. She appeared to be in her 40s, professionally dressed, and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with powerful people. Jerome made mental notes about the woman's appearance and behavior, information that would be crucial for identifying her role in any potential corruption network. The FBI's investigation had revealed that corrupt officials often used intermediaries to facilitate bribe payments or coordinate illegal activities, and this unscheduled meeting could represent exactly that type of contact. The woman's conversation with Peterson appeared intense and focused, with both individuals leaning forward across the table and speaking in hushed tones. Their body language suggested they were discussing matters of significant importance, and Peterson's frequent glances around the restaurant indicated concern about being overheard. After 30 minutes, the woman slid a manila envelope across the table to Peterson, who quickly placed it beside him on the booth seat. The exchange was subtle but unmistakable to Jerome's trained eye, a classic handoff that could involve documents, photographs, or other materials relevant to corrupt activities. Jerome finished his coffee and left the shop, walking slowly past the restaurant's windows while maintaining the casual pace of someone heading home after an evening out. Through the glass, he could see Peterson examining the contents of the envelope while the woman watched his reaction carefully. The intelligence gathered during this surveillance would require careful analysis by Jerome's team. The identities of Peterson's dinner companions, the nature of their relationships, and the significance of the envelope exchange would all need to be investigated thoroughly. Each piece of information brought the FBI closer to understanding the scope and mechanics of the corruption they were investigating. 3 weeks had passed since Jerome's initial court appearance, and the investigation had expanded significantly. FBI surveillance teams were now monitoring multiple targets throughout Chicago's federal court system, gathering evidence of a corruption network that appeared more extensive than initially suspected. Jerome maintained his routine as defendant Jerome Williams, making required check-ins with his pretrial services officer and meeting regularly with Agent Chen to discuss his fabricated legal case. Each interaction provided opportunities to observe courthouse operations and personnel while building credibility for his undercover identity. On a rainy Thursday morning, Jerome arrived at the courthouse for a scheduled status conference with Judge Peterson. The hearing was routine, a brief update on discovery progress and scheduling of future proceedings, but it would provide another opportunity to assess Peterson's behavior and gather intelligence about courthouse operations. Campbell and Morrison were again assigned to courthouse security, their presence near the metal detectors creating the same uncomfortable atmosphere Jerome had observed during his initial visit. Their casual racism had evolved into a predictable pattern of commentary about defendants and visitors, particularly those who were minorities or appeared to lack financial resources. "Look at this crowd today," Campbell said to Morrison as Jerome approached the security checkpoint. "Rain must bring out all the lowlifes who can't afford covered parking." Morrison chuckled while examining IDs and directing people through the metal detector. "At least we're inside where it's dry. These people probably walked here from the bus stop." Jerome placed his keys and phone in the plastic bin, maintaining the respectful demeanor he had established during previous visits. Campbell barely glanced at Jerome's identification before waving him through the detector, his attention focused on a young Hispanic man whose nervous behavior had attracted scrutiny. "Empty your pockets completely," Campbell ordered the man, whose English was limited but who was clearly trying to comply with instructions. "Everything out where we can see it." The man fumbled with his wallet and phone, accidentally dropping some coins that scattered across the floor. Campbell's expression hardened as he watched the man scramble to collect the fallen items. "This is what I'm talking about," Campbell muttered to Morrison. "Can't follow simple instructions, probably here on some drug charge." Jerome observed the interaction while collecting his belongings, noting how Campbell's assumption about the man's charges was based entirely on his ethnicity and apparent economic status. The man was actually visiting the courthouse to resolve a civil immigration matter, information that would have been clear if Campbell had bothered to examine his paperwork rather than relying on prejudiced assumptions. The elevator ride to the 7th floor provided Jerome with an opportunity to overhear conversations between other defendants and their attorneys. Many were discussing plea bargains and sentencing recommendations, while others expressed confusion about court procedures and their legal rights. The complexity of the federal system created numerous opportunities for corruption, as defendants who lacked experienced representation were vulnerable to exploitation. Agent Chen was waiting in the hallway outside Peterson's courtroom, reviewing case files with the careful attention of a defense attorney preparing for a routine hearing. His performance had been flawless throughout the operation, maintaining his cover identity while coordinating with Jerome's FBI team to gather intelligence about courthouse corruption. "Good morning, Jerome," Chen said as Jerome approached. "Ready for today's status conference?" "As ready as I can be," Jerome replied, playing his role as an anxious defendant still adjusting to the federal court system. "Any word on when we'll receive the rest of the discovery materials?" "The prosecutor promised everything would be available by next week," Chen said. "We should have a clearer picture of their case after we review those documents." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Assistant United States Attorney Bennett, who nodded professionally to both men before entering the courtroom to prepare for the hearing. Bennett's conduct throughout the investigation had remained ethical and professional, focusing on the evidence rather than engaging in the prosecutorial misconduct that sometimes accompanied corruption cases. Judge Peterson's courtroom was less crowded than during Jerome's initial appearance, with only a handful of cases scheduled for status conferences. Jerome and Agent Chen took their seats at the defendant's table, while Bennett organized her materials at the prosecution table. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Peterson entered the courtroom. "This court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Harold Peterson presiding." Peterson reviewed his docket before calling Jerome's case. "United States versus Jerome Williams. Counsel, are you ready to proceed with today's status conference?" "Yes, Your Honor," both Bennett and Chen replied simultaneously. Peterson's handling of the brief hearing was professional but revealed subtle patterns that Jerome had been documenting throughout the investigation. The judge's tone and demeanor varied depending on the defendant's race and apparent social class, with more formal courtesy extended to white defendants represented by private attorneys and less patience shown toward minorities with public defenders. "Mr. Williams," Peterson said, addressing Jerome directly, "I trust you're complying with all conditions of your pretrial release?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jerome replied respectfully. "I've reported to pretrial services as required and haven't traveled outside the district." Peterson made notes on his paperwork before addressing the attorneys about scheduling future proceedings. The hearing concluded within 10 minutes, but Jerome had gathered valuable intelligence about Peterson's judicial temperament and decision-making patterns. As Jerome and Agent Chen left the courtroom, they encountered Campbell and Morrison in the hallway. The officers were escorting a handcuffed defendant who appeared to have violated his bail conditions. Their manner professional but cold. "Move along," Campbell ordered the defendant, who was struggling to keep pace while wearing leg shackles. "Court's not going to wait for you to figure out how to walk." Morrison opened the courtroom door while Campbell guided the defendant inside, neither officer showing concern for the man's obvious difficulty navigating the restraints. Their treatment was technically within policy guidelines, but demonstrated a lack of basic human compassion that characterized their approach to law enforcement. Jerome continued down the hallway with Agent Chen, passing the courthouse snack bar where several court employees were taking their morning break. Among them was Andre Johnson, the court clerk who had processed Jerome's bail payment with such professionalism weeks earlier. Andre was engaged in conversation with two other clerks, discussing upcoming changes to court procedures and their impact on daily operations. His colleagues clearly respected his knowledge and experience, seeking his input on handling various administrative challenges. "The new electronic filing system should streamline things once everyone gets used to it," Andre was saying. "It'll take some adjustment, but it should reduce paperwork errors and speed up processing times." Jerome noted Andre's constructive attitude and professional focus, which continued to contrast sharply with Campbell and Morrison's negative approach to their duties. Andre's commitment to improving courthouse operations for everyone's benefit demonstrated the kind of public service that should be the standard throughout the system. After leaving the courthouse, Jerome walked to a nearby park where he could make secure phone calls without risk of surveillance. His FBI team had been monitoring the targets identified during the investigation, gathering evidence of corrupt activities that extended far beyond the courthouse itself. Special Agent Isaiah Davis answered on the first ring. Davis was Jerome's deputy director for criminal investigations and had been coordinating the surveillance operation from FBI headquarters in Washington. "How did this morning's hearing go?" Davis asked, using language that would be appropriate for a friend inquiring about legal proceedings. "Routine, but informative," Jerome replied. "Our friend the judge continues to show interesting patterns in his decision-making." "We've been documenting similar patterns from our observations," Davis said. "The financial analysis team has identified some unusual transactions that correlate with specific court decisions." Jerome understood that Davis was referring to evidence of bribe payments linked to Peterson's rulings in other cases. The FBI's financial investigators had been tracking bank records and other monetary transactions that suggested corrupt officials were receiving payments in exchange for favorable treatment of certain defendants. "What's the timeline looking like?" Jerome asked. "We should have enough evidence to move forward within the next few weeks," Davis replied. "The pattern is clear, and we've identified most of the key players." Jerome felt a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation at the news. Months of careful planning and dangerous undercover work were approaching their conclusion, with the promise of justice for the victims of courthouse corruption finally within reach. The investigation had revealed a network of misconduct that included not only Judge Peterson's acceptance of bribes, but also discriminatory treatment by security personnel, evidence tampering by court staff, and prosecutorial misconduct by certain assistant U.S. attorneys. The scope of corruption was broader than initially suspected, requiring a comprehensive response that would address systemic problems rather than just individual bad actors. Jerome returned to his fabricated apartment to prepare for the next phase of the operation. His undercover identity would need to be maintained for a few more weeks while the FBI gathered final pieces of evidence and prepared for simultaneous arrests of all targets. Mrs. Rodriguez greeted Jerome in the hallway, maintaining her cover as a concerned neighbor while actually providing security for the FBI director's undercover residence. "You look like things went well today," she observed, studying Jerome's expression for signs of how the courthouse visit had proceeded. "Better than expected," Jerome replied. "My lawyer thinks we're making progress." Their brief conversation was part of the elaborate deception that had been maintained for months, creating a believable life story for Jerome Williams that would withstand scrutiny from anyone who might be investigating his background. Inside his apartment, Jerome activated the electronic countermeasures that protected his communications with FBI headquarters. The investigation was entering its most critical phase, when accumulated evidence would be transformed into indictments and arrests that would send shockwaves through Chicago's federal court system. The evening's surveillance activities would focus on Campbell and Morrison, whose discriminatory behavior represented a different but equally important aspect of the corruption investigation. Their casual racism and abuse of authority demonstrated how systemic bias could poison the administration of justice, creating an environment where some citizens received fundamentally different treatment based on their race or economic status. Jerome prepared for another night of patient observation, knowing that each piece of evidence brought him closer to exposing the truth and ensuring that justice would ultimately prevail. The investigation had reached a crucial turning point as Jerome's FBI team uncovered connections between courthouse corruption and organized crime activities throughout Chicago. What had begun as a focused inquiry into judicial misconduct had evolved into a complex web of criminal relationships that extended far beyond the federal courthouse. On a cold November morning, Jerome arrived for another routine check-in with his pretrial services officer, a requirement that provided legitimate access to courthouse administrative areas while maintaining his cover identity. The pretrial services office was located on the 4th floor, adjacent to the probation department and other agencies that supervised defendants awaiting trial. Officer Tracy Coleman supervised Jerome's pretrial release conditions with the professional detachment of someone managing dozens of similar cases. Coleman was a veteran probation officer with 15 years of experience in the federal system, known for her strict adherence to regulations and fair treatment of all defendants regardless of their backgrounds. "Good morning, Mr. Williams," Coleman said as Jerome entered her office. "How are you adjusting to the pre-trial release conditions?" "Fine, thank you," Jerome replied, settling into the chair across from Coleman's desk. "I've been complying with all requirements and haven't had any problems." Coleman reviewed Jerome's file on her computer, noting his perfect compliance with reporting requirements and travel restrictions. Unlike some officers in the courthouse, Coleman treated every defendant with respect while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. "Your next court date is scheduled for December 3rd, Coleman said. "Make sure you notify this office if there are any changes to your address or employment status." Jerome assured Coleman that he would comply with all requirements, then left her office and walked toward the elevator bank. As he waited for the next available car, he overheard a conversation between two courthouse employees discussing recent personnel changes in the security department. "Did you hear about the new assignments for courthouse security?" one employee was asking the other. "Something about bringing in additional officers from different districts," came the reply. "Supposedly it's temporary, but nobody seems to know why they need extra security." Jerome filed away this information as potentially significant. Increased security measures could indicate that law enforcement agencies were preparing for major arrests or that courthouse administrators had become aware of security vulnerabilities. Either possibility suggested that the investigation might be approaching its conclusion. The elevator arrived and Jerome rode to the ground floor where Campbell and Morrison were beginning their shift at the security checkpoint. Their arrival routine was predictable casual conversation with other officers, coffee from the courthouse snack bar, and positioning themselves where they could observe and comment on the stream of defendants and visitors entering the building. "Another day in paradise," Campbell said to Morrison as they checked their equipment and reviewed the day's security briefings. "At least it's steady work," Morrison replied. "Better than walking a beat in some of the neighborhoods we used to patrol." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a group of defendants and their families, including several elderly people who were moving slowly due to mobility issues. Campbell's expression showed annoyance at the prospect of processing people who might require additional time or assistance. "Great," Campbell muttered under his breath. "Looks like it's going to be one of those days." Jerome observed the security checkpoint from a position near the information desk, noting how Campbell and Morrison's attitudes affected their interactions with courthouse visitors. Elderly defendants were treated with impatience, minorities faced additional scrutiny, and anyone who appeared confused by security procedures was subjected to condescending explanations. Andre Johnson was working at the information desk, providing directions and assistance to visitors who needed help navigating the courthouse's complex layout. Andre's patient explanations and genuine concern for people's needs continued to exemplify the professional standards that should guide all courthouse personnel. "The immigration court is on the 6th floor," Andre was explaining to a nervous young woman holding a thick folder of documents. "Take the elevator to 6, then follow the signs to courtroom B. If you get lost, there's another information desk on that floor." The woman thanked Andre repeatedly, her relief evident as she received clear directions and reassurance about finding the correct courtroom. Andre's kindness provided a stark contrast to the indifferent or hostile treatment that other courthouse employees sometimes showed to visitors. Jerome made his way to the courthouse law library, where his fabricated identity as a defendant representing himself would justify spending time researching legal precedents and procedures. The library was quiet and well organized, with computer terminals providing access to legal databases and shelves lined with case reports and statutory materials. Agent Chen was already in the library, ostensibly researching Jerome's tax evasion case while actually coordinating intelligence-gathering activities with other undercover FBI agents positioned throughout the courthouse. Chen looked up as Jerome entered, nodding acknowledgement while maintaining the appropriate distance between attorney and client in a public setting. Jerome selected several tax law references and settled at a table where he could observe other library users while appearing to research his legal defense. The library attracted a mixture of pro-se defendants, law students conducting research, and attorneys preparing for hearings, creating an environment where surveillance activities could be conducted without attracting attention. At a nearby table, two men were engaged in hushed conversation about court procedures and scheduling matters. One was Assistant United States Attorney Robert Hayes, whom Jerome had observed dining with Judge Peterson weeks earlier. The other was a defense attorney Jerome didn't recognize, though their familiar interaction suggested a long-standing professional relationship. "The Peterson thing should be resolved by next month," Hayes was saying quietly. "Our friend has been very cooperative about scheduling and procedural matters." Jerome strained to hear more of their conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. Hayes and the defense attorney were discussing what sounded like coordination between prosecution and defense strategies, potentially indicating the kind of collusive behavior that corrupted the adversarial system. "What about the security concerns?" the defense attorney asked. "Are we going to have problems with the new oversight procedures?" Hayes glanced around the library before responding. "That's being handled at a higher level. We just need to maintain normal operations until everything settles down." Their conversation continued for several more minutes before both men collected their materials and left the library. Jerome made careful mental notes about their discussion, recognizing that Hayes's comments about "our friend" and security concerns could provide crucial evidence of corrupt relationships between prosecutors and defense attorneys. The intelligence Jerome had gathered suggested that the corruption network included not only Judge Peterson, but also prosecutors and defense attorneys who were coordinating their activities to ensure predetermined outcomes in certain cases. This type of collusion represented one of the most serious forms of judicial corruption, as it completely undermined the adversarial system that was supposed to protect defendants' rights. Jerome spent another hour in the library, reviewing legitimate legal materials while observing other users and listening for additional intelligence about courthouse corruption. The library's quiet atmosphere made it an ideal location for sensitive conversations, and Jerome suspected that corrupt officials used it regularly for coordination meetings. At noon, Jerome left the library and walked to the courthouse cafeteria, where courthouse employees gathered for lunch and informal discussions about their work. The cafeteria's casual atmosphere often produced valuable intelligence as people relaxed their guard while eating and socializing. Campbell and Morrison were seated at a corner table with two other police officers Jerome hadn't seen before. Their conversation was animated and included frequent laughter, suggesting they were discussing topics of personal interest rather than official business. "You should have seen this guy yesterday," Campbell was telling the group. "Comes in wearing a $1,000 suit, claims he can't afford a private attorney. These white-collar criminals think they can fool everyone." Morrison nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and the public defenders eat it up every time. They never question whether these guys are really as broke as they claim to be." Jerome recognized that Campbell was likely referring to him, given the timing and description of the defendant in question. The officer's assumption that he was lying about his financial situation demonstrated their cynical view of defendants and their tendency to make judgments based on limited information and personal prejudices. "The whole system's backwards," one of the new officers said. "These criminals get better treatment than honest citizens who follow the rules." Their conversation revealed attitudes that went beyond simple prejudice to include fundamental misunderstandings about the purpose and function of the criminal justice system. Officers who viewed defendants as inherently dishonest and undeserving of constitutional protections were likely to abuse their authority and violate citizens' rights. Jerome finished his lunch and left the cafeteria, having gathered valuable intelligence about the attitudes and relationships among courthouse security personnel. The information would be crucial for documenting the culture of bias and misconduct that enabled corruption to flourish within the federal court system. The afternoon brought another surveillance opportunity as Jerome positioned himself in Grant Park, across from the restaurant where Judge Peterson regularly met with his associates. FBI surveillance teams had been documenting these meetings for weeks, photographing Peterson's contacts and identifying the individuals who comprised his corruption network. At 3 o'clock, Peterson arrived at the restaurant accompanied by the same woman Jerome had observed during his previous surveillance. Their body language suggested familiarity and comfort, indicating a relationship that extended beyond casual professional interaction. Jerome maintained his position on a park bench, using a newspaper to conceal his observation of the restaurant while appearing to be a man enjoying an afternoon in the park. The November weather was cold but clear, providing excellent visibility for surveillance activities. Peterson and the woman were joined by two other individuals Jerome recognized from FBI surveillance photographs: a local businessman named Thomas Mitchell, who had been linked to city contracting corruption, and a lawyer named Robert Stone, who represented several clients with ongoing federal cases. The four-person meeting lasted for over an hour, with papers exchanged across the table and animated discussions that suggested significant business was being conducted. Jerome noted the time, duration, and participants in the meeting, intelligence that would be crucial for establishing the scope and organization of the corruption network. As the meeting concluded, Peterson and his associates left the restaurant separately, each taking different routes that suggested awareness of potential surveillance. Their operational security measures indicated sophisticated criminal activity rather than casual misconduct. Jerome remained in the park for another 30 minutes, observing the restaurant and surrounding area for any additional surveillance or counter-surveillance activities. The corruption investigation had revealed criminal behavior that extended far beyond simple bribery, encompassing organized efforts to manipulate the federal court system for financial and political gain. The intelligence gathered during this surveillance would be analyzed by FBI teams overnight, with additional surveillance planned for the following day. Each meeting, each conversation, and each financial transaction brought the investigation closer to the evidence needed for successful prosecutions of all network participants. As Jerome prepared to return to his fabricated apartment, he reflected on the complexity and significance of the investigation he was leading. The corruption network they had uncovered threatened the foundation of judicial fairness and constitutional protection that formed the basis of American democracy. Exposing this network and ensuring accountability for its members represented one of the most important missions of his career as FBI director. The investigation had been running for 4 months when Jerome noticed subtle changes in courthouse security procedures that suggested law enforcement agencies were preparing for significant action. Additional surveillance cameras had been installed in key areas. Certain personnel were being reassigned without explanation, and there was an underlying tension among courthouse employees that indicated awareness of external scrutiny. Jerome arrived at the courthouse for what was scheduled to be a routine pretrial conference with Agent Chen, but both men understood that the meeting would actually serve to coordinate the final phases of the FBI operation. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming, documenting systematic corruption that reached into every level of the federal court system in Chicago. Campbell and Morrison were at their usual positions near the security checkpoint, but Jerome noticed they seemed more alert and focused than in previous weeks. Their casual conversation had been replaced by careful attention to their duties, and they were examining identification documents more thoroughly than had been their practice. "Morning, officers," Jerome said politely as he approached the metal detector. Campbell looked up from Jerome's identification, studying the document more carefully than usual before returning it. "Mr. Williams, right? You've got that hearing today with Judge Peterson." It was the first time Campbell had demonstrated any knowledge of Jerome's specific case or court schedule, suggesting that security personnel were paying closer attention to defendant movements and activities. This increased awareness could indicate that courthouse administrators had received warnings about potential security threats or ongoing investigations. "Yes, sir," Jerome replied respectfully. "Just a brief status conference with my attorney." Morrison operated the metal detector while observing Jerome's demeanor for signs of nervousness or suspicious behavior. Their heightened attention suggested they had received briefings about potential threats or had become aware that federal investigators were monitoring courthouse activities. Jerome proceeded through security without incident, but he noted the changed atmosphere and filed it away as potentially significant intelligence. Increased security measures often preceded major law enforcement actions, and the timing suggested that other agencies might be preparing to move against courthouse corruption targets. Agent Chen was waiting in the consultation room adjacent to Peterson's courtroom, reviewing case files with the intense focus of an attorney preparing for important proceedings. Chen's expression was serious as Jerome entered, and he gestured toward a chair while continuing to study his documents. "We need to discuss some developments in your case," Chen said, maintaining his cover identity while actually providing Jerome with updates on the FBI investigation. "There have been some changes in the prosecution's approach that we need to address." Jerome understood that Chen was referring to intelligence about the corruption network's activities and the FBI's preparation for arrests and indictments. The changes in prosecution approach likely meant that corrupt prosecutors were altering their strategies in response to awareness of federal scrutiny. "What kind of changes?" Jerome asked, playing his role as a concerned defendant. Chen opened a folder containing documents that appeared to relate to Jerome's tax evasion case, but actually contained coded updates on surveillance activities and evidence gathering. "The prosecution seems to be accelerating their timeline. They're pushing for plea negotiations earlier than we expected." This information confirmed Jerome's suspicions that courthouse personnel were becoming aware of external pressure and were attempting to conclude pending cases before federal investigators could gather additional evidence. Corrupt officials often tried to eliminate potential witnesses or evidence by rushing cases through the system. "Are you concerned about our defense strategy?" Jerome asked. "Not concerned, but we need to be prepared for all possibilities," Chen replied. "Sometimes cases develop in unexpected ways, and we need to be ready to adapt our approach." Jerome understood that Chen was referring to the possibility that their undercover operation might be discovered, requiring immediate extraction and acceleration of the arrest timeline. Both men had been prepared for this contingency since the beginning of the operation. Their meeting was interrupted by a knock on the consultation room door. Agent Chen opened it to find Andre Johnson, the court clerk, who had consistently demonstrated professionalism and courtesy throughout Jerome's appearances. "Excuse me, Mr. Chen," Andre said apologetically. "Judge Peterson needs to reschedule this morning's status conference. There's been an emergency scheduling conflict." This was unusual, as federal judges rarely rescheduled routine proceedings without significant cause. Jerome and Chen exchanged glances, recognizing that Peterson's schedule change could indicate awareness of surveillance or preparation for activities that required his absence from normal duties. "When would the judge like to reschedule?" Chen asked. "Possibly next week," Andre replied. "His clerk will contact you with specific dates and times." Andre's manner remained professional, but Jerome detected subtle signs of stress in his voice and posture. Court personnel were clearly feeling pressure from circumstances they didn't fully understand, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty throughout the courthouse. After Andre left, Jerome and Chen discussed the implications of Peterson's schedule change and what it might indicate about the investigation's timeline. If Peterson was becoming suspicious of surveillance or had received warnings about federal scrutiny, it might be necessary to accelerate the operation before evidence could be destroyed or witnesses intimidated. "We should probably prepare for contingencies," Chen said carefully. "Sometimes these cases require flexible approaches." Jerome nodded, understanding that Chen was suggesting they needed to be ready for immediate action if the situation warranted it. The investigation had reached a critical point where maintaining cover was less important than preserving evidence and ensuring the safety of all participants. They left the consultation room and walked toward the courthouse exit, passing through corridors that had become familiar over the months of Jerome's undercover operation. The hallways were busier than usual, with additional security personnel and what appeared to be federal agents conducting discreet surveillance of courthouse activities. Campbell and Morrison were still at the security checkpoint when Jerome passed through on his way out of the building. Both officers watched him more carefully than in previous visits, their attention focused and professional rather than casual and prejudiced. "Have a good day, Mr. Williams," Campbell said as Jerome collected his belongings after passing through the metal detector. The polite farewell was completely out of character for Campbell, who had never shown Jerome anything but indifference or barely concealed contempt. This change in behavior suggested that security personnel had been briefed about treating all courthouse visitors with increased courtesy and professionalism. Jerome walked to the bus stop, maintaining his routine as a defendant using public transportation while actually proceeding to a secure location where he could communicate with his FBI team. The intelligence gathered during this courthouse visit indicated that the investigation was approaching a critical juncture that would require immediate decisions about timing and tactics. Special Agent Isaiah Davis was waiting at a coffee shop 6 blocks from the courthouse, positioned where he could observe Jerome's arrival while appearing to be an ordinary customer reading the morning newspaper. Davis had been coordinating surveillance activities throughout the investigation and was prepared to authorize emergency extraction if Jerome's cover was compromised. "How did things go this morning?" Davis asked as Jerome joined him at a corner table. "Interesting developments," Jerome replied quietly. "Our friend Peterson rescheduled unexpectedly and security seems to be operating at a higher alert level." Davis nodded grimly. "We've been observing similar changes throughout the target network. Financial surveillance indicates unusual account activity, and several targets have altered their normal routines." Jerome understood that the corruption network was showing signs of awareness about federal scrutiny and was potentially taking steps to protect themselves from investigation. This awareness could result from information leaks within law enforcement agencies or from the target's own security measures detecting FBI surveillance. "What's our timeline looking like?" Jerome asked. "We're recommending acceleration," Davis replied. "The evidence we have is sufficient for indictments, and waiting longer risks compromising the entire operation." This news was both satisfying and concerning for Jerome. The investigation had been successful in gathering extensive evidence of corruption, but accelerating the timeline meant that some intelligence-gathering opportunities would be lost, and certain aspects of the network might escape scrutiny. "How much time do we have?" Jerome asked. Davis checked his watch before responding. 48 hours, maybe less. We need to be prepared to move immediately if the situation requires it." Jerome felt the familiar tension that accompanied the conclusion of major undercover operations. Months of careful planning and dangerous surveillance were about to culminate in arrests and prosecutions that would expose systematic corruption within one of America's most important institutions. The afternoon brought additional surveillance activities as Jerome observed courthouse personnel and corruption network members going about their daily routines, unaware that federal agents were documenting their every move and preparing comprehensive cases against them. Jerome positioned himself in the park across from Peterson's favorite restaurant, maintaining surveillance of the location where many of the corrupt meetings had been observed and documented. The November weather had turned colder, with gray clouds suggesting the possibility of snow, but Jerome remained at his post despite the uncomfortable conditions. At 2 o'clock, Peterson arrived at the restaurant alone, an unusual departure from his normal practice of meeting with associates. His body language suggested anxiety and concern as he entered the establishment and took a table near the rear of the dining room. 10 minutes later, the woman Jerome had observed at previous meetings entered the restaurant and joined Peterson at his table. Their conversation appeared intense and urgent, with both individuals leaning forward and speaking in hushed tones that suggested serious concerns about their situation. Jerome observed their meeting through binoculars concealed within a newspaper, documenting the participants' behavior and body language for inclusion in the FBI's surveillance reports. The urgency of their discussion confirmed that corruption network members were aware of increased scrutiny and were attempting to coordinate their responses to federal investigation. After 30 minutes, Peterson and the woman left the restaurant separately, each taking circuitous routes that indicated awareness of potential surveillance. Their operational security measures demonstrated sophisticated criminal activity and suggested that the corruption network had received training or advice about countering law enforcement surveillance. Jerome maintained his surveillance position for another hour, observing the restaurant and surrounding area for additional meetings or suspicious activities. The intelligence gathered during this surveillance would be crucial for understanding how corruption network members were responding to pressure and what steps they might be taking to avoid prosecution. As evening approached, Jerome prepared to return to his fabricated apartment for what might be his final night as undercover defendant Jerome Williams. The investigation was reaching its conclusion, and within days, the truth about courthouse corruption would be exposed through arrests, indictments, and trials that would restore integrity to the federal court system in Chicago. The morning of the coordinated arrests dawned gray and cold, with a December wind that seemed to cut through the heart of Chicago. Jerome had been awakened at 4 a.m. by a secure phone call from Deputy Director Davis, confirming that Operation Courthouse Justice would commence at precisely 8 o'clock that morning. Jerome dressed in his familiar Navy suit, the same modest attire that had defined his Jerome Williams persona for months. Today, however, the clothing served a different purpose, maintaining his cover identity until the moment when his true role would be dramatically revealed to the shocked targets of the investigation. The FBI command center had been established in a building 6 blocks from the courthouse, with teams of agents coordinating simultaneous arrests throughout the city. Jerome's undercover operation had been just one component of a massive investigation that ultimately identified 37 individuals involved in various aspects of courthouse corruption. Agent Chen arrived at Jerome's apartment at 6:30, maintaining his cover as defense attorney David Chen while actually serving as Jerome's security detail during the final phase of the operation. Both men understood that the next few hours would be dangerous, as corrupt officials facing exposure might attempt desperate measures to avoid prosecution. "Ready for the biggest hearing of your life?" Chen asked with a slight smile, the first time during the entire operation that he had allowed his professional facade to crack. "More ready than I've been for anything in years," Jerome replied, feeling the satisfaction that came with knowing justice would finally be served. They left the apartment building together, passing Mrs. Rodriguez in the hallway. The retired FBI agent nodded politely, maintaining her cover as a concerned neighbor while actually providing final security clearance for Jerome's departure. "Good luck today, Jerome," she said warmly. "I hope everything works out for you." "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez," Jerome replied. "I think it's going to be a very good day." The bus ride to the courthouse provided Jerome with final opportunities to observe the city he had come to know intimately during his months undercover. Chicago's morning commuters hurried through streets that would soon be filled with federal agents, news crews, and citizens learning about the massive corruption scandal that had infected their federal court system. Jerome and Chen arrived at the courthouse at 7:45, 15 minutes before the coordinated arrests were scheduled to begin. Campbell and Morrison were at their usual positions near the security checkpoint, unaware that their careers in law enforcement were about to end in disgrace and criminal charges. "Morning, Mr. Williams," Campbell said with the newfound politeness that had characterized his recent behavior. "Another hearing with Judge Peterson?" "Actually," Jerome replied quietly, "I think today's going to be quite different from our usual routine." Campbell looked puzzled by Jerome's cryptic response, but before he could ask for clarification, the courthouse's main entrance doors opened and a stream of FBI agents entered the building. The agents moved with purposeful efficiency, their badges visible and their expressions serious as they took positions throughout the lobby. Special Agent Isaiah Davis led the group, his authoritative presence commanding immediate attention from courthouse personnel and visitors. Davis had coordinated hundreds of arrests during his career with the FBI, but this operation represented one of the most significant public corruption cases in recent memory. "Ladies and gentlemen," Davis announced in a voice that carried throughout the courthouse lobby, "I am Special Agent Isaiah Davis of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are conducting arrests in connection with a federal investigation of public corruption. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of FBI personnel." Campbell and Morrison stood frozen at their security checkpoint, their faces showing confusion and growing alarm as they realized they were witnessing a massive federal law enforcement operation. Other courthouse personnel stopped their morning routines, watching in stunned silence as FBI agents took control of the building. "Campbell Ryan, badge number 4789, Davis called out, reading from a federal arrest warrant. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice." Campbell's face went pale as two FBI agents approached him, their movements professional and non-threatening but unmistakably authoritative. "There must be some mistake," Campbell stammered, his voice shaking as the reality of his situation began to sink in. "Morrison Steve, badge number 2156, Davis continued. "You are also under arrest on identical charges." Morrison attempted to back away from the approaching agents, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon before he realized the futility of resistance. "We haven't done anything wrong," he protested weakly. "We're just doing our jobs." "You have the right to remain silent," the arresting agent told Campbell as handcuffs were applied. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Jerome watched the arrests with the satisfaction of seeing justice finally served, but his attention was focused on the larger operation unfolding throughout the courthouse. FBI agents were simultaneously arresting targets on multiple floors, coordinating their actions to prevent evidence destruction or witness intimidation. The courthouse lobby had become a scene of controlled chaos as employees and visitors tried to understand what was happening around them. Andre Johnson stood behind his information desk, his professional composure intact despite the shocking circumstances unfolding before him. "What's going on?" Andre asked one of the FBI agents as Campbell and Morrison were led away in handcuffs. "Federal corruption investigation," the agent replied briefly. "The courthouse will remain open, but some operations may be disrupted while we complete our arrests." Andre nodded, already thinking about how to help courthouse visitors navigate the unusual circumstances. His commitment to public service remained unwavering even as his workplace was turned upside down by revelations of corruption among his colleagues. On the 7th floor, another FBI team was placing Judge Harold Peterson under arrest in his chambers. Peterson's shock was evident as agents read the charges against him: conspiracy to commit bribery, honest services fraud, and obstruction of justice. "This is outrageous," Peterson protested as handcuffs were applied. "I am a federal judge appointed by the President of the United States. You cannot treat me like a common criminal." "You'll have the opportunity to address these charges in court, Your Honor," the arresting agent replied respectfully but firmly. "For now, you need to come with us." Jerome and Agent Chen made their way through the courthouse, observing the arrests and coordinating with FBI teams throughout the building. The months of careful planning were paying off as every target was apprehended without violence or significant resistance. Assistant United States Attorney Robert Hayes was arrested at his office on the 5th floor, where agents found him attempting to delete files from his computer. The evidence of Hayes's corrupt activities was overwhelming, including recorded conversations documenting his coordination with defense attorneys to fix case outcomes. "I want to call my attorney," Hayes demanded as he was handcuffed. "You'll have that opportunity at the processing facility," the arresting agent responded. "Right now, we need you to come with us." The Corruption Network's financial coordinator, Thomas Mitchell, was arrested at his downtown office while attempting to transfer funds to offshore accounts. FBI financial investigators had been monitoring his activities for weeks, documenting his role in laundering bribe payments and coordinating corrupt transactions. Defense attorney Robert Stone was apprehended at the courthouse parking garage as he attempted to leave the building with a briefcase full of documents. Stone's role in the conspiracy involved accepting payments to provide inadequate representation to certain defendants, ensuring convictions that served the interests of the corruption network. Jerome's fabricated case had been dismissed as part of the operation's conclusion, with prosecutor Lisa Bennett informed that the charges against Jerome Williams were being dropped due to prosecutorial misconduct by other attorneys in her office. Bennett's ethical conduct throughout the investigation had cleared her of any wrongdoing. As the arrests continued throughout the morning, Jerome prepared for the most dramatic moment of the entire operation. At 10 o'clock, he would reveal his true identity to courthouse personnel and the media, exposing the FBI's unprecedented undercover operation to combat judicial corruption. The courthouse press briefing room was filled with reporters who had been summoned for what they were told would be a major announcement about federal law enforcement activities. Jerome stood behind a podium flanked by American flags, still wearing the modest navy suit that had defined his undercover persona. Deputy Director Davis introduced Jerome to the assembled reporters, though none of them yet understood the significance of the man they were about to hear from. "Ladies and gentlemen," Davis began, "I want to introduce you to someone who has been working undercover in this courthouse for the past 4 months, gathering evidence of systematic corruption that has resulted in today's arrests." Jerome stepped forward to the podium, his expression serious as he prepared to reveal the truth about Operation Courthouse Justice. "Good morning," Jerome said, his voice carrying the authority that came with years of leading the nation's premier law enforcement agency. "My name is Jerome Washington, and I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The press briefing room erupted in shocked murmurs as reporters realized they were witnessing an unprecedented revelation. The FBI director himself had gone undercover to investigate corruption in a federal courthouse, risking his personal safety and professional reputation to ensure justice was served. "For the past 4 months," Jerome continued, "I have been operating undercover as defendant Jerome Williams, facing fabricated federal tax evasion charges while gathering evidence of systematic corruption within this courthouse." Jerome's revelation sent shockwaves through the room as reporters frantically took notes and camera operators adjusted their equipment to capture every word of this historic announcement. The investigation has resulted in the arrest of 37 individuals, including a federal judge, prosecutors, defense attorneys, court personnel, and law enforcement officers, Jerome explained. These individuals were involved in a conspiracy to corrupt the administration of justice through bribery, evidence tampering, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. The scope and significance of the corruption scandal was becoming clear to the assembled reporters who were witnessing the exposure of one of the largest judicial corruption cases in American history. "I want to emphasize," Jerome continued, "that the vast majority of personnel in this courthouse are honest, dedicated public servants who perform their duties with integrity and professionalism. Today's arrests target a criminal minority who betrayed the public trust and violated their oaths of office." Jerome's comments about honest courthouse employees included specific recognition of Andre Johnson, whose professional conduct and commitment to treating all visitors with dignity had impressed him throughout the investigation. The FBI's investigation documented systematic discrimination against minorities and economically disadvantaged defendants, evidence tampering designed to ensure predetermined case outcomes, and acceptance of bribes in exchange for favorable rulings, Jerome explained. The revelation of discriminatory treatment provided context for Campbell and Morrison's arrests, as their racist commentary and biased behavior had been thoroughly documented throughout the investigation. I want to assure the public that today's arrests represent the beginning, not the end, of our commitment to restoring integrity to this courthouse, Jerome concluded. The FBI will continue investigating any evidence of corruption, and we will ensure that justice is served for all victims of these crimes. As Jerome concluded his remarks and took questions from reporters, the full impact of the investigation was beginning to reverberate throughout Chicago and beyond. The FBI director's personal commitment to going undercover had produced evidence that would result in significant prison sentences for corrupt officials and comprehensive reforms to prevent future misconduct. The news of FBI Director Jerome Washington's undercover operation spread across the nation within hours of his press conference. Major news networks interrupted regular programming to report on the unprecedented investigation, while social media platforms buzzed with discussions about the FBI director who had posed as a criminal defendant to expose judicial corruption. Jerome returned to FBI headquarters in Washington that afternoon, where he was greeted by agents and staff who had supported the operation while maintaining absolute secrecy about their director's dangerous undercover assignment. The successful conclusion of Operation Courthouse Justice represented a significant victory for federal law enforcement and the rule of law. In Chicago, the arrested corruption network members were being processed at federal detention facilities throughout the city. Campbell and Morrison sat in separate holding cells, their law enforcement careers destroyed and their futures uncertain as they faced serious federal charges that could result in decades in prison. Campbell stared at the concrete walls of his cell, trying to process how his casual racism and abuse of authority had led to federal prosecution. The conversations he had thought were harmless had been carefully documented by FBI agents, providing evidence of systematic civil rights violations that violated both federal law and his oath as a police officer. Morrison was similarly struggling to understand how his discriminatory treatment of courthouse visitors had escalated into federal charges. The comments and behavior that he had justified as normal law enforcement practices were now being characterized as criminal conspiracy to deny citizens their constitutional rights. Judge Peterson sat in a federal holding cell designed for high-profile defendants, his judicial robes replaced by an orange jumpsuit that symbolized his fall from respected jurist to accused felon. The evidence against Peterson was overwhelming, including recordings of conversations coordinating case outcomes in exchange for financial payments. Peterson's corruption had affected dozens of cases over several years, resulting in wrongful convictions and unjust sentences that had destroyed innocent lives. The FBI was reviewing every case Peterson had handled, identifying victims who would need to have their convictions overturned or sentences reduced. Assistant United States Attorney Robert Hayes faced similar circumstances as he contemplated the evidence that would be used against him in his own prosecution. Hayes had violated his prosecutorial oath by coordinating with defense attorneys to ensure predetermined case outcomes, betraying both his office and the defendants who deserved honest representation. The financial coordinator, Thomas Mitchell, was being held in a separate facility while FBI agents analyzed the extensive evidence of money laundering and bribery coordination they had gathered during months of surveillance. Mitchell's role in the corruption network made him a key witness who could provide testimony about the organization's operations and participants. Defense attorney Robert Stone's arrest had sent shockwaves through Chicago's legal community as attorneys realized that one of their colleagues had been providing deliberately inadequate representation to clients in exchange for payments from corrupt prosecutors and judges. Andre Johnson arrived at work the following morning to find the courthouse transformed by the previous day's events. Media crews filled the plaza outside the building, while FBI agents continued their investigation by reviewing files and interviewing witnesses throughout the complex. Despite the chaos surrounding him, Andre maintained his professional demeanor and continued providing assistance to courthouse visitors who were confused by the unprecedented circumstances. His commitment to public service had earned him recognition from FBI Director Washington during the press conference, highlighting the difference between corrupt officials and dedicated public servants. "Excuse me," said a nervous young woman approaching Andre's information desk. "I'm supposed to appear in Judge Peterson's courtroom today, but I heard on the news that he was arrested. What am I supposed to do?" Andre consulted his computer and the emergency scheduling notices that had been distributed to courthouse personnel. "Your case has been reassigned to Judge Martinez in courtroom C," he explained patiently. "Take the elevator to the 6th floor and check in with her clerk." Throughout the day, Andre fielded similar questions from defendants and attorneys, trying to navigate the disruption caused by the corruption arrests. His calm professionalism helped maintain order during a chaotic period when many courthouse operations were in flux. The investigation's impact extended beyond Chicago as federal prosecutors and FBI agents in other cities began reviewing their own courthouse operations for signs of similar corruption. Jerome's decision to personally conduct undercover surveillance had inspired a nationwide examination of judicial integrity that would result in additional investigations and reforms. At FBI headquarters, Jerome met with Deputy Director Davis and other senior officials to discuss the investigation's findings and their implications for federal law enforcement. The success of Operation Courthouse Justice had demonstrated the value of proactive corruption investigations and the FBI's commitment to holding all officials accountable regardless of their positions. "The evidence we gathered will support prosecutions that should result in significant prison sentences for all network participants," Davis reported. "More importantly, we've identified systemic problems that require comprehensive reforms to prevent future corruption." Jerome nodded, satisfied with the investigation's results, but aware that the work of restoring integrity to the Chicago courthouse was just beginning. "What's our timeline for implementing the recommended reforms?" "The Justice Department is already working with court administration to implement new oversight procedures and ethics training," Davis replied. "We're also establishing a permanent task force to monitor courthouse operations and investigate any reports of misconduct. The reforms would include enhanced financial disclosure requirements for judges and court personnel, regular ethics training for all courthouse employees, improved oversight of case assignments and scheduling, and anonymous reporting systems for courthouse personnel and visitors to report suspected corruption or discriminatory treatment." Jerome's undercover operation had also highlighted the importance of treating all defendants with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, economic status, or the charges they faced. New training programs would emphasize constitutional rights and professional conduct standards for all courthouse personnel. In Chicago, the arrested corruption network members were beginning to face the reality of their legal situations as they met with defense attorneys and reviewed the evidence that would be used against them. Many were considering cooperation with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences, potentially providing additional information about corruption that had not yet been discovered. Campbell's attorney explained that the civil rights charges he faced carried mandatory minimum sentences that could result in years in federal prison. The casual racism that Campbell had thought was harmless had been documented as systematic denial of constitutional rights, making conviction virtually certain given the FBI's extensive evidence. Morrison faced similar charges and was being advised that cooperation with federal investigators might be his only chance to avoid the maximum sentences available under federal law. His discriminatory treatment of courthouse visitors had been carefully documented, providing prosecutors with overwhelming evidence of civil rights violations. Judge Peterson's situation was particularly grave, as federal judges who abuse their positions face enhanced penalties that reflect the seriousness of judicial corruption. Peterson's attorney was already discussing plea negotiations that would require full cooperation with ongoing investigations and acceptance of responsibility for his crimes. The corruption network's financial operations were being systematically dismantled as FBI agents seized bank accounts, properties, and other assets that had been acquired through criminal activities. The financial investigation revealed the sophisticated money laundering operations that had allowed the network to hide their illegal profits. Media coverage of the investigation continued to dominate national news as commentators discussed the unprecedented nature of an FBI director conducting personal undercover surveillance. Jerome's decision to risk his personal safety and professional reputation had resonated with citizens who appreciated his hands-on approach to combating corruption. Public reaction to the investigation was overwhelmingly positive, with citizens expressing admiration for Jerome's commitment to justice and appreciation for the FBI's thorough approach to rooting out corruption. The investigation had restored public confidence in federal law enforcement's ability to police itself and hold powerful officials accountable. Legal scholars praised the investigation's methodology and results, noting that Jerome's undercover operation had produced evidence that would have been impossible to gather through traditional investigative techniques. The personal testimony of the FBI director about discriminatory treatment and corrupt practices would be particularly powerful in court proceedings. Civil rights organizations celebrated the investigation's exposure of systematic discrimination within the federal court system, emphasizing how corrupt officials had denied justice to minority defendants and economically disadvantaged citizens. The investigation's findings would support civil lawsuits seeking compensation for victims of the corruption network. As evening approached, Jerome reflected on the successful conclusion of one of the most challenging and important investigations of his career. Operation Courthouse Justice had required months of dangerous undercover work, but the results had justified the risks by exposing corruption that threatened the foundation of American democracy. The investigation's success would serve as a model for future anti-corruption efforts, demonstrating the FBI's commitment to pursuing justice regardless of the target's positions or influence. Jerome's personal involvement had sent a clear message that no one was above the law, including federal judges and prosecutors who had sworn to uphold justice. 6 months after the arrests, the federal courthouse in Chicago had been transformed into a model of transparency and accountability. The comprehensive reforms implemented in response to Jerome's investigation had created new oversight mechanisms, ethics training programs, and reporting systems that ensured corruption could not flourish undetected. Jerome returned to the courthouse for the first time since revealing his undercover identity, arriving not as defendant Jerome Williams, but as FBI Director Jerome Washington, there to observe the trial of Judge Harold Peterson. The courtroom where Peterson had once presided over cases with corrupt authority now served as the venue for his own prosecution. The irony was not lost on Jerome as he took his seat in the gallery, watching Peterson sit at the defendant's table, where so many innocent people had been wrongfully convicted through his corrupt decisions. Peterson's trial was being conducted by honest federal prosecutors with the integrity that had been absent from his own courtroom. Special Prosecutor Sarah Williams, assigned specifically to handle the corruption cases, presented overwhelming evidence of Peterson's crimes to a jury of Chicago citizens. The recordings, financial records, and surveillance evidence that Jerome's investigation had gathered left no doubt about Peterson's guilt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Williams said during her opening statement, "the evidence will show that Judge Harold Peterson sold his judicial office to the highest bidder, corrupting the administration of justice for personal profit." Peterson's defense attorney attempted to argue that his client had been entrapped by overzealous federal investigators, but the evidence of Peterson's long-standing corrupt activities made this defense strategy futile. The judge's own words, recorded during surveillance operations, demonstrated his willing participation in criminal activities. Jerome observed the proceedings with satisfaction, knowing that Peterson's conviction would send a clear message to corrupt officials throughout the federal system. The judge who had betrayed his oath and violated the public trust would face the consequences of his crimes. Campbell and Morrison had already pleaded guilty to federal civil rights charges, accepting responsibility for their discriminatory treatment of courthouse visitors and their abuse of authority. Both men had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, with additional requirements for community service and civil rights education upon their release. During Campbell's sentencing hearing, the judge had specifically referenced the FBI's surveillance evidence documenting his racist commentary and biased treatment of defendants. "Your behavior was not only criminal but profoundly contrary to the values that should guide law enforcement officers," the judge had stated. Morrison's sentencing had included similar condemnation of his discriminatory practices and abuse of his position as a law enforcement officer. Both men's careers in law enforcement were permanently ended, with their convictions making them ineligible for future employment in any capacity requiring public trust. Assistant United States Attorney Robert Hayes had also pleaded guilty to honest services fraud and conspiracy charges, admitting that he had coordinated with defense attorneys and judges to predetermine case outcomes. Hayes was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and permanent disbarment from practicing law. Defense attorney Robert Stone received a similar sentence for his role in providing inadequate representation to clients in exchange for payments from corrupt prosecutors and judges. Stone's conviction had triggered reviews of all his cases, with several defendants receiving new trials or sentence reductions. The financial coordinator, Thomas Mitchell, had received the longest sentence among the co-conspirators, facing 8 years in federal prison for his role in laundering bribe payments and coordinating the corruption network's criminal activities. His cooperation with federal investigators had helped identify additional cases of corruption and recover funds for victims. Andre Johnson had been promoted to a supervisory position within the courthouse administration, recognition of his exemplary conduct during the corruption investigation. His professional behavior and commitment to treating all visitors with dignity had made him a natural choice for leadership in the reformed courthouse system. "I want to ensure that every person who enters this courthouse receives fair and respectful treatment," Andre said during his promotion ceremony. "The events of last year reminded us that public service means serving all members of the public equally." The courthouse's new ethics training program included sessions led by Andre and other exemplary employees, emphasizing the importance of professional conduct and constitutional rights. The program had become a model for other federal courthouses implementing similar reforms. Jerome's investigation had also triggered a comprehensive review of cases handled by the corrupt officials, resulting in hundreds of convictions being overturned or sentences being reduced. Innocent defendants who had been wrongfully convicted through the corruption network's activities were finally receiving the justice they had been denied. Marcus Thompson, a young father who had been wrongfully convicted of drug charges,
through Campbell and Morrison's evidence tampering was among those whose convictions were overturned. Thompson had spent 2 years in federal prison before Jerome's investigation exposed the corruption that had led to his wrongful conviction. "I never thought I'd see justice," Thompson said during a press conference announcing his exoneration. "FBI Director Washington's courage in going undercover saved my life and my family's future." Similar stories emerged throughout Chicago as victims of the corruption network came forward to share their experiences and seek compensation for the injustices they had suffered. Civil lawsuits against the corrupt officials and their agencies resulted in millions of dollars in damages being paid to victims. The investigation's impact extended far beyond Chicago as federal prosecutors and FBI agents nationwide implemented similar oversight measures to prevent corruption in their own jurisdictions. Jerome's personal commitment to going undercover had inspired a new level of accountability within federal law enforcement. Congressional hearings on judicial corruption featured Jerome's testimony about the investigation and its findings, leading to new legislation strengthening oversight of federal courts and increasing penalties for corrupt officials. Jerome's willingness to personally investigate wrongdoing had earned bipartisan praise from lawmakers. Director Washington's investigation demonstrates the FBI's commitment to upholding justice at every level of our system, said Senator Elizabeth Harris during the hearings. His personal courage and professional dedication have restored public confidence in our federal institutions. The investigation had also highlighted the importance of protecting whistleblowers and encouraging courthouse personnel to report suspected corruption or misconduct. New anonymous reporting systems and whistleblower protections ensured that future corruption could be detected and addressed quickly. Officer James Keller, the young courthouse security guard who had expressed doubts about Campbell and Morrison's conduct, had been commended for his courage in documenting their behavior. Keller's reports had provided valuable intelligence for Jerome's investigation and demonstrated the importance of encouraging honest employees to speak up about misconduct. Jerome reflected on the investigation's broader significance as he watched Peterson's trial conclude with a guilty verdict on all charges. The corrupt judge would face 25 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and the need to deter future judicial corruption. The investigation had demonstrated that corruption could be defeated through careful planning, dedicated investigation, and the courage to take personal risks in service of justice. Jerome's decision to go undercover had required him to place himself in potential danger, but the results had justified the risks by exposing systematic corruption that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. As Jerome left the courthouse that day, he encountered Andre Johnson near the information desk, where they had first met months earlier. Andre's professional conduct throughout the investigation had exemplified the integrity and public service commitment that should characterize all government employees. "Director Washington," Andre said, approaching with the respect due to Jerome's position, but also with the warmth of someone who had witnessed his character under pressure. "Thank you for everything you did to clean up our courthouse. Thank you for maintaining your integrity when others around you had lost theirs," Jerome replied. "Your professionalism and dedication made it clear that corruption was the exception, not the rule in this building." Their conversation was brief but meaningful, representing the restoration of trust and accountability that Jerome's investigation had achieved. The courthouse that had once been infected with corruption now served as a symbol of reform and renewal. 1 year after the conclusion of Operation Courthouse Justice, Jerome Washington stood before a joint session of Congress to deliver his annual address on the state of federal law enforcement. The investigation that had begun with his decision to go undercover in a Chicago courthouse had transformed into a nationwide movement for judicial accountability and civil rights protection. The FBI's annual report documented the investigation's continuing impact. 47 additional corruption cases had been opened in federal courthouses across the country, inspired by the evidence-gathering techniques pioneered in Chicago. Jerome's personal commitment to undercover investigation had established new standards for federal law enforcement leadership. The events in Chicago demonstrated that corruption thrives in darkness, but cannot survive the light of truth, Jerome told the assembled senators and representatives. When we commit ourselves to justice without regard for personal cost or political considerations, we honor the Constitution and serve the American people. The investigation had produced lasting reforms that extended far beyond the specific individuals who had been prosecuted. New oversight mechanisms, ethics training programs, and accountability measures had been implemented in federal courthouses nationwide, creating systemic changes that would prevent future corruption. Campbell and Morrison had been released from federal prison after serving their sentences, but their lives had been permanently altered by their criminal convictions. Both men had undergone court-ordered civil rights education and community service requirements that forced them to confront the harm their discriminatory behavior had caused. Campbell now worked at a community center in Chicago, providing services to the same minority communities he had once mistreated. His mandatory counseling and education programs had helped him understand how his racist attitudes had corrupted his law enforcement duties and violated citizens' constitutional rights. Morrison had found employment with a non-profit organization focused on criminal justice reform, using his experience as both a former police officer and convicted criminal to educate others about the dangers of abuse of authority. His transformation from corrupt cop to reform advocate demonstrated the possibility of redemption through acknowledgement of wrongdoing and commitment to change. Judge Peterson remained in federal prison, serving his 25-year sentence while his cases continued to be reviewed for additional victims of his corrupt decisions. Peterson's fall from federal judge to convicted felon served as a powerful warning to other officials who might be tempted to abuse their positions. Andre Johnson had been selected to lead a new federal training program for courthouse personnel, traveling throughout the country to share the lessons learned from the Chicago investigation. His exemplary conduct during the crisis had made him a natural choice for promoting professional standards and ethical behavior. Every interaction we have with the public is an opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to justice and equality, Andre told training participants. We must remember that we serve all citizens equally, regardless of their circumstances or the charges they face. The training program had become a model for other agencies seeking to improve their professional standards and prevent corruption. Andre's personal story of maintaining integrity while surrounded by corruption had inspired countless government employees to uphold their oaths of office. Thomas Mitchell, the Corruption Network's financial coordinator, had continued cooperating with federal investigators from prison, helping identify additional cases of judicial corruption and money laundering. His ongoing assistance had led to the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen funds and the prosecution of corrupt officials in other jurisdictions. Assistant United States Attorney Lisa Bennett, whose ethical conduct had been exemplary throughout the investigation, had been promoted to a senior position in the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section. Bennett's professionalism during the fabricated prosecution of Jerome Williams had demonstrated the importance of prosecutors who focus on evidence rather than personal or political considerations. The Chicago investigation reminded us that integrity must be our guiding principle in every case, Bennett said during her promotion ceremony. We serve justice, not personal interests or political agendas. Bennett's promotion had inspired other federal prosecutors to maintain high ethical standards and resist pressures to compromise their integrity. Her example demonstrated that honest prosecutors were valued and rewarded within the Justice Department. The civil rights organizations that had praised Jerome's investigation continued to monitor courthouse operations nationwide, using the Chicago reforms as a template for identifying and addressing discrimination in other jurisdictions. The investigation's findings had supported numerous civil rights lawsuits that resulted in compensation for victims and policy changes to prevent future discrimination. Marcus Thompson, whose wrongful conviction had been overturned based on evidence from Jerome's investigation, had become an advocate for criminal justice reform and wrongful conviction prevention. Thompson's personal story illustrated the human cost of corruption and the importance of maintaining integrity throughout the justice system. Director Washington's investigation didn't just save my freedom, Thompson said during a speech at a criminal justice reform conference. It saved my faith in America's promise that justice is available to everyone, regardless of race or economic status. Thompson's advocacy work had helped dozens of other wrongfully convicted individuals navigate the complex process of seeking exoneration and compensation. His transformation from victim to advocate demonstrated the positive change that could result from exposure of corruption and commitment to reform. The investigation's impact on federal law enforcement culture had been profound, with FBI agents nationwide adopting more proactive approaches to investigating corruption and civil rights violations. Jerome's personal example had demonstrated that effective leadership required willingness to take personal risks in service of justice. Special Agent Isaiah Davis had been promoted to Associate Deputy Director, recognition of his outstanding coordination of the Chicago investigation. Davis had implemented new protocols for corruption investigations that emphasized thorough evidence gathering and protection of undercover operatives. Director Washington's investigation set a new standard for anti-corruption work, Davis said during a training session for FBI supervisors. We learned that no target is too powerful and no investigation is too complex if we commit ourselves completely to pursuing the truth. Davis's training programs had been adopted throughout the FBI, creating a new generation of agents dedicated to investigating corruption and protecting civil rights. The techniques developed during the Chicago investigation had been refined and adapted for use in other complex investigations. The congressional legislation inspired by Jerome's investigation had strengthened federal anti-corruption laws and increased penalties for officials who abused their positions. The new laws included enhanced whistleblower protections and mandatory reporting requirements that made it easier to detect and prosecute corruption. Senator Elizabeth Harris, who had led the congressional hearings on judicial corruption, had worked closely with Jerome to draft legislation that addressed the systemic problems exposed by the investigation. The bipartisan support for the reforms demonstrated the universal commitment to government accountability and integrity. Director Washington's investigation reminded us that democracy requires constant vigilance and courage from those entrusted with protecting it, Senator Harris said during the bill signing ceremony. These reforms will help ensure that corruption cannot flourish in our federal institutions. The legislation had been praised by government watchdog organizations and civil rights groups as a significant step toward preventing the kind of systematic corruption that had infected the Chicago courthouse. The new laws would make it easier to investigate and prosecute corrupt officials while protecting honest employees who reported misconduct. Jerome's investigation had also influenced international law enforcement agencies, with several countries implementing similar anti-corruption measures inspired by the FBI's innovative approaches. The investigation's success had enhanced America's reputation for government accountability and rule of law. As Jerome concluded his congressional address, he reflected on the personal and professional journey that had led him from FBI director to undercover defendant and back again. The investigation had required him to risk his career and personal safety, but the results had justified those risks by exposing corruption and restoring public trust in federal institutions. "The fight against corruption is never finished," Jerome told Congress. "It requires constant vigilance, unwavering integrity, and the courage to pursue truth wherever it leads. The American people deserve nothing less than complete commitment to justice from all of us who have sworn to serve them." The standing ovation that greeted Jerome's conclusion reflected not only respect for his position, but appreciation for his personal courage in conducting the investigation. His willingness to go undercover had demonstrated a level of commitment to justice that inspired others to maintain high standards in their own work. As Jerome left the Capitol that day, he knew that the investigation's true legacy lay not in the individual prosecutions it had produced, but in the cultural change it had inspired throughout federal law enforcement. The courthouse in Chicago had been transformed from a symbol of corruption into a model of accountability and reform. The investigation had proven that truth would ultimately prevail over deception, that justice would triumph over corruption, and that courage would overcome fear. Jerome Washington's decision to become Jerome Williams had changed not only his own life, but the lives of countless Americans who depended on their government to serve them with integrity and fairness. The story of Operation Courthouse Justice would be remembered as a turning point in American law enforcement, when an FBI director's personal commitment to justice had exposed systematic corruption and inspired lasting reform. The investigation had demonstrated that no one was above the law and that accountability was essential to maintaining democracy and protecting constitutional rights. As Jerome returned to FBI headquarters to continue his work, he carried with him the knowledge that his investigation had made a difference in the lives of ordinary Americans who deserved fair treatment from their government. The corrupt officials had been held accountable, the victims had received justice, and the system had been reformed to prevent future abuse. The legacy of truth that Jerome had established through his investigation would continue inspiring future generations of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and judges to maintain the integrity that was essential to American democracy. The investigation had shown that courage and commitment could overcome even the most entrenched corruption, ensuring that justice would prevail for all Americans.